Hey guys, Rob here with 3D Printscape. So today's video is going to be on the CR-10, specifically upgrading firmware if you have an SKR Mini. I plan on doing additional videos covering firmware upgrades once I get another printer that has one of the Creality 2.x boards, which is in most of the newer CR-10 printers. So diving into that a little bit, there are 7 different versions of the configuration examples for the CR-10. There might be a new one as well. There's just so many different variations that this video is somewhat difficult to make just because of the different variations. So I'm kind of focusing in on the CR-10 with the SKR Mini, like I said. But there are really 3 different categories for firmware. There's going to be the CR-10s with the V1 board, the CR-10s with the V2, and then the CR-10s that have been upgraded to one of the SKR boards or potentially one of the Creality 32-bit boards. I'm not going to do a video covering the V1 boards. Those boards require a bootloader and everything like that. I have a video kind of covering that upgrade on the Ender 3 Pro. The process would mainly be the same. It's just going to be slightly different because of the CR-10 components. The overall process is pretty much the same. So if you're looking to do that, take a look at that video. But honestly, at that point, if you don't already have an Uno board, I would recommend just upgrading to one of the 32-bit boards. You're going to get the silent drivers, and it's going to be much better to do upgrades going forward. If you have one of the V2 boards and you're looking to keep that and you're just doing a simple upgrade for firmware or adding in a BLTouch, I'll do a video covering that process coming up soon. I'm going to buy a CR-10 coming up pretty soon, but I'll also be getting my Ender 5 Plus back probably early next month, so I'll be able to cover the upgrade process using the 2.5 board that's in that printer. So before we jump over to the computer and get started, if you guys haven't already, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. It'll really help the channel grow. Thanks. Alright guys, so we're here at the computer. The first thing we want to go ahead and do is download the firmware. You want to go to the Marlin firmware download page for that, which I'll link to in the description below. But basically, if you want the latest actual release build, you'll download from here. If you want the bug fix build, which is what I typically use, you'll go to bug fix or the nightly builds and download that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then we want to jump over to our configurations to get our starting points. And then I'll talk about the different versions of the CR-10 there once we extract all of that. But let's go ahead and do that really quick. And then I just download the entire thing just so we have all of the configs there. Alright, then once those are done, I just dragged them over to a folder under firmware. I just created a CR-10 folder, so it's basically close to the root of the drive so we don't have any path issues. If you run through this process and you start to see any issues related to file not found or folder not found, it's likely because your path is too far. Windows has restrictions on the length of the file name, and this is all built under Linux, which doesn't have that restriction. If you're close to the root of the drive, you shouldn't run into issues though. But you can see here I did C firmware CR-10. So I'm just going to extract both of these really quick. And then once the actual firmware one's extracted, I just copy that folder because it has the same folder name as the actual file itself over to where it was, and I'll just rename it there. That way you don't have the length there twice. In this case, because I had downloaded this before, it had the 1 at the end from my downloads folder, so I would just delete that folder. Now it's empty. But typically if it was the same name, it would just replace it. So go delete that. Now let's extract the configurations. Alright, now that that's done, let's go ahead and download VS Code. That's going to be the editor that we're using to actually make our changes and build the firmware. So you just go to the VS Code download page, which I'll link to in the description below, and then download for whatever OS you're running. I'm running Windows 11 right now, so I would just go here and download the 64-bit installer. And then once that's done, you'll launch that and run through the installer with all the default settings. I already have it installed, so I can't really run through that, but you're literally just hitting next on everything, so it's a pretty simple install. And then once that's done, you can go ahead and load it. Then we want to install a couple plugins. The first time we load VS Code, it'll probably look something similar to this. You'll want to just go to extensions, and then there's a couple that I like to install. First one that is absolutely required is the Platform IO IDE. You would just search for that right here, and then it will pop up, and then you'll just hit install here. And then it might ask you to restart VS Code, it might not, but if it doesn't, I would restart it anyway. And then that's also going to install this C and C++ plugin as well. And then I have a video covering the auto build plugin. I recommend it. It just makes some of the environment details a lot easier, so you don't have to really think about them. But to install it, you would just search for it here again, and then just hit the install button. And if you have any questions about that, check out the video. I go into a little bit of detail there, but it really does help. And then it's also worth mentioning that if you run into any type of errors related to environment variables or anything like that, there's a Python plugin. Let me just search for it really quick. It's this one right here. If you install this, a lot of times it fixes those issues. It's not directly tied to that. A lot of times those type of issues can come up if you had a lot of other things installed in the computer, things that could have potentially messed with environment variables. But sometimes this does just fix it for you. It's just more of something I've noticed working with a lot of people in the community. So just keep that in mind. It's not needed though, unless you're running through some of the more advanced configurations and doing some stuff. I think, what one was it? It was the NeoPixels, I believe, required it. But if you're not doing any of that, I wouldn't worry about it unless you run into issues. All right, so let's go back over to our firmware folder. When you open this in VS Code, you want to make sure that you're opening the folder that has this platform io.ini file. A lot of people just jump straight into this Marlin folder, which only has the configuration files, and it allows you to make those configuration changes, but when you go to build it, the checkbox or the build button won't actually be there because it's missing most of the files. It just has the configurations. So you want to make sure that you open this, and I'll show you that here in a second. Before we do that though, let's go ahead and open the Marlin folder, and then we want to get our configuration examples as a starting point. So like I mentioned in the video, there are a lot of different versions of the CR-10, so I wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about that here. So if we go into configurations, go into config examples and Creality, here's where some of the issues come in with the CR-10. There are 7 different versions. Most of them are shipping with different editions of the 8-bit board. There are some with the V1 board, some with V2. Anything, if you go into any of these configs here, if you see a folder for V1, that means it has one of the version 1 boards. So like my Ender 3 Pro had a 1.4.4. Those boards require a bootloader to be installed before you can actually update the firmware. The ones like the V2 or V3 here, these are for the Creality V2 boards. It's still 8-bit, but if I'm not mistaken, you don't need a bootloader to actually push the firmware to those. I will be making a video hopefully in the next couple months covering how to actually do the upgrades on those 8-bit boards. I am going to skip doing the upgrade on the V1 boards just because there's so much involved. If you have one of those boards and don't actually want to upgrade to a 32-bit board, you can look at my Ender 3 firmware video, the first one I did. It covers upgrading the V1.4.4 board. There's just a lot to it because you have to install the bootloader, and at that point, if you don't have an Uno board already, you're going to be spending about 20 bucks or so to get that, and a 32-bit silent board, you're looking at probably $30 or $40, maybe $45. So you're almost halfway there. So at that point, I would just get the new board. Let's say that you put in the SKR Mini E3 V2 like I talked about at the beginning of the video. You go into CR-10, you would grab that configuration example here, copy these 4 files, and move them over to the firmware folder under Marlin, and then replace the existing files when it prompts you. And then we'll go ahead and open that up in VS Code in a second. This video is kind of jumping around a little bit just because there are so many different variations based on the different boards. So like here, the S5, it actually has the E3 V3 config example, but none of these have a Creality 4.2.2 or 4.2.7 config examples. I guess they're not really expecting you to upgrade to those with these boards, though they would probably work here. This one has the V2 again. So that's going to be the most popular upgrade for the CR-10 as far as boards go. That's why I'm covering it in this video. and price-wise, it's still very reasonable. But again, if you have one of those Creality 2.x boards, I'm going to be getting a CR-10 pretty soon. I'll make sure to get one of the ones with those boards so that I can do the upgrade for you. All right, so let's go ahead and jump over to VS Code. So at this point, you should have already had VS Code installed and the plugins or extensions we talked about installed as well. Now we want to go up to File, Open Folder, and go to our folder where we have everything. So I've got it on my C drive, Firmware, CR-10, and Marlin. Now remember, don't open the Marlin folder under this one because that just has the config files. And one thing I like to do before making any changes is I like to just do a quick build to make sure that there aren't going to be any issues. That way you know if there are issues, it could be related to the build itself since it's bug fix, and not necessarily your environment. So I just go down to the auto build plugin, show panel, and then just go ahead and hit build. Alright, now that that built successfully, we can go to make our changes. I'm going to split the changes into two sections. One, just if you want to update the firmware to Marlin and you don't really care about the BLTouch or filament runout sensor. And then I'll go into the changes needed if you have a BLTouch or have the filament runout sensor. If you don't know which board you have, you can look at the actual chip on the board. If you see RCT6, it's going to be 256K. If you see RET6, it's going to be the 512K. But most of them, I believe, have the 256K chip in them. All right, so let's go to make our changes. Just go up to Explorer, go down over to Marlin and configuration.h, and then we can go ahead and search for the first set of changes that I typically make if I'm not adding a BLTouch or anything. First one is going to be EEPROM init underscore now. This is basically, it will automatically clear your EEPROM for you when you push the firmware, so you don't have to worry about doing it manually. This will save you some headaches down the road. I've had some random issues if you don't. Then go over to the configuration advanced over here, and then search for show s underscore SD. Then you want to uncomment this. This is basically going to just show you your percent complete. And really, that's all there is to it as far as changes that I make on a default build. I mean, you can do small changes like change the name that shows up on the printer. So for example, if you go ahead and just search for custom underscore machine, you'll get the machine name. You can change this to whatever. I mean, you can leave it at the CR10 or just do CR10. Make a note that you have the SKR Mini, or I'll just do like 3D Printscape. And then that'll show up on the screen now. Then once those changes are made, you'll just go over to your build and go ahead and kick off a build again. It should take less time this time because it already pulled down most of the files that were needed on the last run, on your test run, but it will still take a couple minutes. Alright, now that that's done, you would go ahead and copy the output of that. So you can click here, it will bring up that location for you, then this .bin file, and then you would copy this firmware.bin file onto your SD card, put the SD card into your printer, and go ahead and turn it on, and it will pull that in. Alright, let's go ahead and make the changes we would want for the BLTouch though, which is probably why a lot of you guys are here. Let's go back to our configuration.h file and search for z underscore min underscore probe. Go ahead and hit the next. Alright, so depending upon how you have your BLTouch or CR-Touch wired, you'll have to either comment this out or leave it alone. If you're leaving the Z-stop connected and putting all 5 wires of the BLTouch or CR-Touch into the BLTouch port, which is what I would recommend, you would want to comment this out and then uncomment use probe for Z-homing. If you leave this uncommented, it's going to think that you have the probe connected to the Z-stop port, and it's going to actually try to use that, and it's not going to get the right reading, and it's just going to hit the bed. All right, then scroll down a little bit. you'll see BLTouch. You want to uncomment that. That is true regardless if you have a BLTouch or a CR-Touch. To the firmware, they're basically the same thing. Then you want to scroll down to the offsets. So this has a similar amount to what's on the Ender 3 Pro, so I'm going to go ahead and use the values that I have there, which is -44 and -7. You can, if you have a custom fan duct cover or something like that, you are going to want to measure those and enter the correct values. To get those, what you want to do is measure the distance from the nozzle to the probe on both the X and Y axis. Most of the time, you're going to have a negative value for both of the numbers, because typically here is going to be your nozzle, and then the probe with most of the mounts end up being over here. If you have a mount that it's putting it on the right hand side, that is going to change up a bit. You will have a positive number over there, so just keep that in mind. But if you're using the stock mount, that little metal bracket, -44 and -7 should work for you. Next, we want to search for auto bed leveling bilinear. Scroll down, we want to uncomment that and then comment out mesh bed leveling. That way we're getting the right type of leveling for the BLTouch. Then we want to search for Z_safe_homing and uncomment that. Next, we want to search for min_software_instop. And we want to comment out the one for Z. So what this is doing is it allows you to go into a negative number for your Z offset. If you don't do that, it won't let you go below 0, and you won't be able to set your Z offset properly. You will be able to disable that at the printer, but you'll have to be able to send a G-code command to it, so you'd have to have it either connected to Octoprint or Pronterface if it's connected to your computer, and run the M211S0 command to disable it. I know some people recommend just going that way because it's safer. I personally just like to disable it in the firmware because it's easier and I'm lazy. All right, next you can search for grid_max_points. This here will give you your grid size. So if you have 5 here, it's going to be a 5x5 grid. If you want to change it to 3, it would be a 3x3 grid, so it'd be 9 points that it probes for the mesh. Or go up to 7, it'll be a 7x7, so it'll be at 49 point. 5 is typically fine, but if you have a really warped bed, you could potentially have issues, and you might need to make adjustments there. Let's go ahead and jump over to our configuration_advanced file. Then we want to search for probe_offset, and then we want to uncomment the probe offset wizard. This is just a tool that makes setting the Z offset much easier because it does a lot of the work for you as far as calculations and setting everything. And then you used to have to uncomment baby stepping as well, but that is uncommented by default in most examples, but you could search to make sure. Yeah, see here. And this one it is uncommented as well. And that's going to be it for your BLTouch. If you have a filament runout sensor, you go back over to configuration H, search for filament_runout_sensor. And you would uncomment this. You want to uncomment the pause and park features. So go ahead and search for park. You want to make sure that nozzle park feature is uncommented, and then go over to configuration_advanced and then search for pause. Advanced pause for filament change. You want to make sure that that is uncommented as well. Depending upon your configuration example, it may or may not be. That's why I like to search for it. The last time I actually went through this, I assumed it would have been uncommented, and then I got an error from the sanity check basically saying that you need to uncomment this for it to work. So yeah, just don't make assumptions because these files vary pretty drastically between different printers. All right, so let's go ahead and go over to our auto build plugin and kick off a build. Alright, then once that's done, you can go and click on the folder to bring up your build. Then again, just like I talked about at the beginning, if you weren't modifying for the BLTouch, you would just copy the firmware.bin file onto the SD card, put the SD card in the printer, and go and power it on. It will pull that in. If you want to do a quick sanity check to make sure that it did actually update the firmware, if you go in the menu, you should see components related to the BLTouch, and if you change the custom name, you would see the updated name there as well. And if you didn't see either one of those changes, you can go to the About menu to see if it changed. If it didn't, you might have potential issues with the SD card or changes that aren't compatible. But everything I talked about here is compatible with the board. And that's really all there is to it. I know a lot of you guys have the Creality 2.x board, so I will be getting the printer so I can do a video covering that. But I had some people ask for this video, so I figured I'd go ahead and get this one created while I can, and then as soon as I get the CR-10, I will go ahead and do a video covering that. I might be able to just use my Ender 5 Plus when I get that back early next month, because it has the 2.5.2 board in it, which I believe is pretty much the same, so I can use that as an example if I don't have the CR-10 one by then. So middle of next month I should have that video out. But if you have any questions about what I covered or would like to see any other videos, go ahead and leave a comment below or join us on Discord. Alright guys, so that covered upgrading a 32-bit board for the Creality CR-10 printers. Like I mentioned, this is a good upgrade if you have a Creality printer that has one of the V1 boards in it. And even the V2, if you're looking to do a lot of upgrades or you have one that doesn't have the silent drivers, this SKR Mini V2 right here is a great option. You can go with the V3 like I have here, but like I mentioned in the video, there aren't really many config examples for it, so if you're not too comfortable working with setting up your own config examples, that might not be a good route for you to go at this point. I do plan on creating another video covering the firmware upgrade for the V2 boards, hopefully in the next month or so, once I get my Ender 5 Plus back or just get the CR-10 printer that has one of those boards. Whichever happens first, I'll use that to do the video. But if you have any questions about what I covered or would like to see any other videos, go ahead and leave a comment below or join us on Discord.